How you doing, folks? I'm Mark Dutram with BayView Private Wealth. We are coming to you today with a little bit of backdrop with regards to the debt ceiling and why this is such a recurring issue. So perhaps a little bit of background, so bear with us here. You know, the normal budget process starts with the president submitting a budget proposal to Congress in early February for the upcoming fiscal year. So Congress is currently working on fiscal year 2024, right? Where it runs from October through September of 2024. And this process consists of budget meetings and resolutions, appropriation bills, all of which has to be considered by Congress in the following months. So interestingly though, or sadly I should say, in the past 25 years, Congress has never actually completed the budget by the start of the fiscal year. So thus necessitating the passage of a series of continuing resolutions until the budget process can be finally finished. As importantly, no changes can be made to appropriations or the tax code without a majority vote in both houses of Congress and the president's signature. So on top of this process, over 100 years ago, the government instituted a debt ceiling in 1917, actually, to help monitor the U.S. funding contribution toward World War I. Since then, the limit has been suspended or raised over 100 times. Think about that, guys. So I'd say it's become quite the norm for this to happen. You know, there's a lot of political theater around this process. And you might remember in 2011 that the Standard & Poor's downgraded our federal U.S. debt for the first time in history. And then again in 2013 was another year where we came very close to an actual default. So since then, the debt ceiling has been raised or suspended 5 times without actually a lot of controversy. Most recently in December 2021, the debt ceiling was raised to $31.4 trillion. I mean, that's just a massive amount of money. And it was roughly $2.2 trillion higher than the public debt that was subject to the limit at the time. But of course, annual deficits since then have added to the debt, and here we are again. So what's happening in the current cycle? Well, in January, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced that the federal government again had reached the limit and was initiating kind of these extraordinary measures to pay the bills. She estimated that the combination of the Treasury's cash balances and these extraordinary measures would allow the federal government to pay the bills at least until early June. As you know, Republicans have a very narrow majority in the House, and last November they vowed to rein in budget spending from the administration in return for a vote to increase or suspend the debt ceiling. Well, as of May 1st, the federal government had about $300 billion in its checking account. They currently projected budget deficits of about $188 billion and $144 billion in May and June, which would leave the Treasury short by about $38 billion. So we're talking about sometime in June, but because of the variability of daily cash flows, the Treasury Department is unlikely to know the precise X date until a few days before. So where are we on negotiations? Well, on the House Republican side, which has, again, a very narrow majority, Kevin McCarthy succeeded in rounding up 217 Republican votes to pass a bill that would raise the debt ceiling by about $1.5 trillion, or until next March, whichever came first. Because of all the cuts that are in this bill, though, it will clearly not pass a Democratic Senate or be signed by the president. The administration, for its part, claims that it will not negotiate on raising the debt ceiling and is urging Congress to pass a clean debt ceiling bill, so no cuts. So what can't happen? I mean, it's important to know this. I often hear people suggest some ways to satisfy this standoff or resolve the matter without increasing the debt limit. So it's important to rule out what really can't happen, guys. First of all, there's no way at this stage of the game to balance the budget to avoid a debt limit from rising. The CBO estimates in the current fiscal year spending is around 6.2 trillion, revenue is at about 4.8 trillion, resulting in a budget deficit of about $1.4 trillion. So the majority of this spending obviously consists of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and actually interest payments on the current debt now that rates have risen. Second, a last-minute prioritization of spending is really not practical. Some have argued that the federal government could avoid immediate default by prioritizing the debt payments over all other bills that the federal government has to pay. Well, there are many problems with this, but this would, of course, be a mere stopgap, since it would only avoid default in the long run if the budget were actually balanced. Third, and the so-called 14th Amendment option is filled with a ton of hazards. Section 4 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution declares that the validity of all public debt in the United States authorized by law is essentially, it shall not be questioned, basically is what it says. So according to some legal scholars, this gives the president the right to ignore the debt ceiling. However, this issue has been really hotly debated over the years and has never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court. Fourth, some have argued that the Treasury Department could just simply mint $1 trillion coin and deposit it at the Federal Reserve to continue paying its bills. However, this approach would also set up an incredible legal fight with a very uncertain outcome. So what should happen? Once all of this is understood, it's clear that the only eventual end to this crisis is a bipartisan bill passing Congress to raise or suspend or even eliminate the debt ceiling. It will have to be a bipartisan, as it needs the majority of the Republican-controlled House and 60 votes in the Democratic-controlled Senate. In the best of all worlds, Congress would have the courage to both eliminate the debt ceiling altogether and set about, the reform of spending and taxes required to bring the budget back to balance in the long run. What we need is for our elected officials to actually do their jobs. You think about the investment implications for the debt ceiling, and it's pretty significant. Either way, as we just said, the debt ceiling will have to be raised or suspended, and it's going to have to be by a bipartisan vote. And, the only real question is, then how soon do we get to this point? If the administration and congressional leadership make it clear that this is where we're headed and immediately start negotiating in earnest, then it's possible to imagine that an increase of the debt ceiling passing before the end of May could be possible. If this were to happen, markets would largely ignore the fiscal debate that's happening, and they would resume their focus on the more important things of watching if there's a recession, kind of the pace of inflation that we've been trying to tame, and the overall hawkishness of the Federal Reserve. If in the act of kind of more recklessness, Congress fails to increase or suspend the debt ceiling in time, the Treasury is likely going to miss an interest payment on the debt. This event would likely precipitate a really significant major stock market downturn, and you'd see a spike in Treasury rates, you'd see a decline in the dollar, a further downgrade to the U.S. debt would probably occur as well. After a few days of chaos, Congress would likely suspend the debt ceiling for a period and to get back to negotiating an actual budget. However, even if that happened, some default risk premium would likely permanently be added to U.S. Treasuries, and the uncertainty caused by the crisis would increase the likelihood of a near-term recession, which we're trying to avoid. However, it's best not to think about the debt ceiling crisis as a potential rerun of the great financial crisis we had back in 2008. Restoring confidence in the U.S. banking system in the wake of that subprime crisis was an incredibly complicated task. By contrast, recovery from a debt default crisis would likely start the day Congress suspends the debt ceiling. Getting close to default, or actually defaulting, would just likely reduce the confidence we have and that the world has in our U.S. political leaders. So let's pray together for some consensus building in Washington and some fiscal responsibility, right? We've needed that for years. Guys, we hope this brings some light to the debt ceiling that's out there. Again, it's going to have to be raised. Let's just hope that we can get some budgets going. As always, we hope that we've added some value. We appreciate you. If you have any questions or concerns, please give us a call. Have a great day, my friends.